I think I'm going to try and talk for 20, 30 minutes, and then maybe we have a discussion about some of the things I talked about, or anything really. What I'm going to try and do is tell you the story, a little bit of which is in this book, but a story of what happened to me as a British diplomat, what it showed me about diplomacy, and indeed about government, which I hope will be interesting. There's also, I should add, if you want the full story, there's a movie that's just been broadcast on BBC4 last Sunday on Storyville, which you can watch on iPlayer, which is the full movie version of this talk. Anyway, it's not a terribly common thing to be a diplomat. I always wanted to be one. I think partly because it was venerated in my family. My grandfather worked as a codebreaker at Bletchley Park with Alan Turing. That was, in fact, a Foreign Office institution. And I was celebrated in my family as the stupidest because evidence of which is I'm a twin and my twin brother was put in the year ahead of me. So the manifestation of my inferiority was very public. So nobody expected me to succeed in passing the exams to become a British diplomat, which were quite competitive. In the year I got in, 20 people got out of 5,000 applicants. So a bit like coming to work for Google now. This surprised everybody, not least of all me, but I was very pleased because I was fascinated by international relations. I'd always read the newspaper from a very early age, from cover to cover, reading about Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion, nuclear deterrence. I was particularly fascinated by nuclear weapons theory, mutually assured destruction, stuff like that. And so I became a diplomat in 1989, which, as Jan particularly would testify, was an extraordinary year in world history. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact dispensation, a real sense of triumph in the West, of the ultimate victory of Western values, of Western democracy, of what you might call neoliberal economics, market economics. There's many terms for it, but a sort of modulated capitalism like what we have now. And indeed, British diplomats were sent particularly to Eastern Europe to share the know-how of how we ran democracy and capitalism in the West, to help other countries live like we did. Francis Fukuyama was often misquoted as calling it the end of history, but a sense of us having reached some kind of apogee irreversibly in the human project was very, very much suffused the air in places like the Foreign Office. And indeed, I was a believer. I very much believed in that system. I believed that sensible people in government like me had the ability, the competence, the knowledge, and indeed the authority to make decisions on behalf of the whole. For that is the premise of representative government, that small numbers of people take decisions on behalf of large numbers of people. And in my field, I was making decisions along with my colleagues about foreign policy. Where really remarkably small numbers of people make decisions of extraordinary importance. I worked on various different issues. I was sent to Bonn, Jan's hometown, so we've been comparing street addresses this morning, which was then the British Embassy before it moved to Berlin after reunification. I worked on the global environment, the first World Summit on the environment in Rio in 1992, the so-called Earth Summit, when we talked about climate change as a danger to humanity 300 years from now, and a thing called the precautionary principle, that we should act now to make it easier for humanity in 300 years' time. I worked on the Middle East peace process, as it was then known in better days. I don't think you could call it a peace process now. I worked on international terrorism. I was for a while speechwriter for two foreign secretaries, for a Conservative and then for a Labour foreign secretary, Robin Cook, who promptly fired me as his speechwriter. Again, a very public humiliation in the Foreign Office, so humiliation I am familiar with, because you're not really fired in the British government or in the civil service. You're just moved on to another job, and a minister actually firing his speechwriter is quite a public act, and everybody responded with great glee to this public dismissal. And I was rather upset because I saw myself as a sympathiser with Labour foreign policy, and indeed with Robin Cook himself, with whom, of course, I was working closely, or so I thought. And with that, I was sent to the British mission to the United Nations in New York as a kind of consolation prize, because it's very, very good posting. It's a sort of really high-level diplomacy. Of course, it's a very nice place to get posted to. And I was given responsibility for the Middle East in the British delegation to the United Nations, which was an amazing, amazing job. I was responsible for dealing with Middle East issues at the UN Security Council, negotiating resolutions, statements. And in those days, the UN Security Council was an incredible cockpit of world diplomacy, of world affairs. And we were dealing with extraordinarily important issues, from Israel-Palestine to the occupation of Western Sahara to the Libya Lockerbie issue. And above all, Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction. And I was responsible for that issue in the British delegation, and I was the main British liaison with the weapons inspectors, so I got to know in great detail all about weapons of mass destruction. I could tell you the residual chemicals left by the nerve gas VX after it has been left in a desert for 10 years. I could tell you the names of the officers in charge of Saddam Hussein's special weapons regiments. I could tell you how exactly to adapt an imported Scud missile to make it a longer range Al-Hussein missile, as it was called. I knew the exact number of missiles that the inspectors were looking for. You can tell where this is heading. And it was an amazing job. One felt very important. I was chased around the UN by CNN film crews and scores of diplomats. Britain is, of course, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and thus of considerable importance, not as important as one or two others, but very important. And we drafted all of the resolutions on Iraq during my time there. I spent a year negotiating a resolution that set up the weapons inspection body that was eventually headed by Hans Blix. UNMOVIC, which is an acronym that I came up with, my small footnote in history, a combination of the letters MOV, Monitoring, Observation, Verification, Inspection, Commission. And that's the only way you can turn those... Anyway, Scrabble fans might be interested. All of this started to unravel with 9/11, which was the most spectacular shock to all of us dealing with the Middle East, although in some ways not a surprise because we knew immediately who was responsible. The US turned into something else after that date, and the Bush administration decided to pursue war with Iraq. And in order to provide a veil of legitimacy, the British tried to get resolutions through the UN Security Council to authorize that use of force. And of course, those resolutions, or that particular resolution, was not agreed by the UN Security Council. By that time, I was actually on sabbatical from the Foreign Office. I was sitting in a New York library, scratching my head, trying to work out what might be a better political and economic system than the one we had, because 9/11, like for most people, had kind of flipped a switch in my head. But also, I had, living in New York City, you have to be an idiot not to be aware of the profound economic injustice manifested in America, the fact that children are literally going without meals 4 miles away from where people are stuffing high-grade sushi down their throats. It's pretty blatant there. The dynamics of climate change were becoming clear, and I was starting to doubt the sorts of words I had written for my foreign secretary about how governments had things under control, because I began to see that they didn't, and I began to see that those words were kind of fake. And so I took a year off, and whilst I was sitting in that library, Britain tried to get these resolutions through the UN Security Council, I was very, very conscious of what was going on. I was in touch with Blix, who was trying to understand the resolution that I had negotiated on the weapons inspections. I was in touch with my colleagues, weapons inspectors, amongst them David Kelly, the biological weapons expert, who was later to commit suicide after being outed by the British government as the source of a story that the British government had exaggerated the evidence on WMD. Anyway, in 2004, those of us who'd worked on Iraq were invited to testify to the first official inquiry into the war, the Butler inquiry, and I decided to testify. I wrote a long document explaining my views that the threat from Iraq had been grossly exaggerated by the British government, that the war was illegal, according to the resolutions that I myself had negotiated, and the British government had ignored alternatives to war, which is a complicated story about sanctions and economic restrictions. It's never talked about because everybody focuses on did they lie or not, but in fact is in many ways much more important because there were peaceful alternatives to undermining the Saddam regime. I wrote papers about them, and I know for a fact that these were not considered before Britain went to war in 2003. Anyway, when I wrote that testimony, I had a crisis. I thought, I can't send this testimony in and remain a British diplomat. You can't ride two horses at once. I negotiated that my testimony would be secret because I wanted to remain in the Foreign Office. I wanted to have it both ways. I'd just been promoted to the senior ranks of the Foreign Office. Everything was tickety-boo. I was well on my way to being an ambassador somewhere. Maybe Belarus, but things were pretty good with my career, and I thought, I could tell the truth to this inquiry, but still have my career. And the act of literally, I remember very clearly pressing the button on the computer where I was of the send button or return button, and I realised when I pressed that button that I couldn't do this. I couldn't go back and work with my colleagues. I couldn't sit with ministers who I knew had done this terrible, terrible thing. And so this was the end for me as a diplomat, and I had no idea what I was going to do next. I'm just going to get a drop of water. And thankfully, I was married to an incredible woman who kept me going, but also gave me the idea that I should become a consultant. And at the time I was living in Kosovo on secondment to the United Nations. And Kosovo at that time was subject to a diplomatic process about the future of Kosovo that concerned 6 countries that were secretly negotiating about whether Kosovo should become a state or not. The UN Security Council would have meetings about Kosovo, where 15 members of the Security Council could speak, and indeed any member state of the UN could speak in the so-called open meetings, including Serbia. But guess what? Kosovo could not speak, had a democratically elected government, but was not entitled to speak, was not entitled to engage with this diplomatic process about the future of Kosovo. And this seemed to me to be somewhat foolish, but also profoundly unjust. And living in Kosovo, I saw how it contributed to immense political tension, frustration of people who felt they had no control over their future. Beginning to sound familiar? Anyway, that led, in part, it was one of the factors behind horrible violence in March 2004, in which 18 people were killed. Mass riots and attacks across the country, which I saw very, very up close. Buildings were burned next to my house. We escaped a mob of people charging after the UN, because the UN, as the symbol of this iniquity, this unjust process, was very widely hated in Kosovo. Anyway, so my wife had the idea, why don't you become a consultant? And I flew back to Kosovo. Oh, by the way, small detail, I had in fact resigned from the Foreign Office. When I pressed that button, I also sent that evidence to the Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, as my resignation letter. They never replied, but a few weeks later I did get an email from my former personnel manager inviting me for psychological counselling in the Foreign Office, perhaps for fear that I would do the same as my poor friend David. Anyway, so I flew back to Kosovo. I could no longer work for the UN. I was no longer with the British government. I flew back to Kosovo and had dinner with the Kosovo Prime Minister, a former leader of the Kosovo Liberation Army, a remarkable man called Ramush Haradinaj, who I've just been discussing in the Barbers in Edgware Road, which of course is full of Kosovars and Albanians. And I said to him, why don't I come and advise you about the diplomacy about Kosovo? And we clinked a glass of raki, which is Albania's spirit. And he said, yeah, come and advise me. And that was the beginning of this organization that I run to this day called Independent Diplomat, which is a charity here in the UK, a non-profit in the US, which advises countries and political movements all over the world on the diplomacy about them. And so it started with Kosovo. I took the Kosovo Prime Minister to the UN Security Council, where hitherto he had been prohibited. I told the Kosovars what was really going on in the diplomatic process. I talked to Martti Ahtisaari, the Finnish UN envoy who was dealing with the Kosovo-Serbia negotiations to decide the future status of Kosovo. Interestingly, all of them accepted the need for what I was doing because they realized it really helped the process for the Kosovo government to understand it. It also helped them push back against the extremists in Kosovo who were saying, this diplomacy is such bullshit, the international community is never going to release us from Serbia's hold, never going to make us independent. We should unilaterally declare independence, which would have been a highly provocative thing and probably would have led to a resumption of war between Serbia and Kosovo. And, of course, the quote-unquote international community did not want that to happen, but hadn't taken the step of actually explaining their expectations that Kosovo would become independent at the end of this process. And Martti Ahtisaari would tell me this privately. He would say to me things that he couldn't say formally to the Kosovars, which I would then convey in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, to the Kosovars. And when they came to the UN, I would help them prepare their speeches, their talking points, press conferences, yada, yada, yada. The sorts of things I did as a British diplomat for my foreign secretary. Anyway, that in essence is what Independent Diplomat does to this day, which is do the sorts of things that I did as a British diplomat for all kinds of peoples, political movements, and governments who are the subjects of diplomatic processes, often where they're not actually part of those diplomatic processes, where other states who have far less of a stake than them are deciding their future. It's only in diplomacy that people think that this is actually okay. And even diplomats, when you put the proposition to them, wouldn't it make sense to have actually people from the ground talking to you about what to do about Palestine, Western Sahara, Somalia, Syria, yada, yada, yada? They say, of course it would make sense, but we can't. They can't come to the UN. That's just not how it's done. That's the state of diplomacy to this day, I'm afraid to say, though we are beginning to chip away at these assumptions through our work. And also the world is changing. The mode of diplomacy, the means of diplomacy has changed. Diplomats now, of course, have to scrutinize Donald Trump's tweets to understand what he is thinking, which is a different form of diplomacy than the one I was brought up with in the 80s, the 90s, and early thousands. So what we do today is we give advice in political strategy in what's called public diplomacy, which is basically PR, and international law, the legal advice on the often very, very complicated international law pertaining to situations like Palestine or the state of the Rohingya in Burma, Myanmar, or Syria. And today, to give you some examples of what we do, we advise the Frente Polisario, which is the legitimate representatives of the people of the Western Sahara, which is illegally occupied by Morocco after an invasion in 1975. Nobody talks about this place, but a great injustice that the world does nothing about. And I'm very proud to advise them. Interestingly, their biggest parliamentary supporter in the British Parliament was one Jeremy Corbyn, which speaks to me that he was prepared to show up for a people that nobody talks about, who Bono doesn't celebrate in his concerts, who Richard Branson doesn't meet, doesn't invite to Davos. They're my kind of people. And we advise one of the interesting, well, they're all interesting in their different ways. We advised the Marshall Islands, which is a low-lying island state in the middle of the Pacific, which is extraordinarily vulnerable to sea level rise. The average height of its atolls are 70 centimeters above the sea. They're already suffering extensive flooding and drought, a double whammy of global warming, and are looking at the destruction of their country within 50 years. And with their help and with us, we have worked to create a whole coalition of countries called the High Ambition Coalition, which, as its name suggests, wants more ambition in global agreements on climate change. And at the Paris Agreement, the negotiation of Paris, in the last days, the High Ambition Coalition, which we had been putting together in secret for years, suddenly surfaced as the most important coalition of countries demanding a particular kind of agreement. It broke up the traditional negotiating blocks of the UN and helped get some of the most important elements of the Paris Agreement inserted. I could talk to you in detail about those if you're interested, but one of them, for instance, is fairly well known, that the agreement aims to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade to 2 degrees centigrade. Before the High Ambition Coalition came along, that was 2 degrees centigrade. You may not think that's a big deal, but in diplomatic terms, it's pretty important. And we also inserted in Paris a stipulation that countries need to come back to the table 5 years after the signature of Paris with better carbon emissions commitments than they made in Paris, the so-called ratchet. That was invented by two members of Independent Diplomat sitting in a cafe in Majuro, the little capital of the Marshall Islands. So a real example of empowering the most affected, the most vulnerable in diplomacy. And a great cause to be fighting, because one of the things I've learned about this work is that actually by empowering the most vulnerable, you're empowering everybody. Because when you give those most affected a voice, they tend to speak of what needs to be done in a way that carries enormous authority. And of course, we need to deal with climate change, and there is no more authoritative voice than a country that is actually facing destruction from climate change. As a result of the Marshall Islands and the High Ambition Coalition, the Paris Agreement is significantly stronger than it otherwise would have been, which is a global result that is important to every one of us. How shall I put this? A different kind of project is our work with the Syrian opposition, the Democratic Syrian Opposition, the Higher Negotiating Committee, which is an aggregation of democratic groups in Syria. And we've also helped create a coalition of Syrian civil society groups from all over Syria, doctors' groups, women's refugee groups, to empower them to take part in the diplomacy about Syria. Because, of course, one of the problems with diplomacy is that it privileges governments and states, and it privileges leaders and the sorts of people who become leaders of political movements, who are often great people, who often are legitimate in what they say to the world community about the needs of their people. But there is nothing more powerful than the people themselves. And having been with this delegation of Syrian civil society at the UN General Assembly, meeting world leaders, diplomats, officials, it is extraordinarily powerful when they speak of what needs to happen in Syria for their needs to be addressed. And we get beyond the bullshit of Russia thinks this and Trump thinks that and ISIS and no-fly zones and Security Council resolutions and the crap that flies between the left and right in this country about what to do in Syria. And you actually get to the brass tacks from Syrians because, of course, funnily enough, it is Syrians who should have the largest voice in the future of Syria. Not us, not the West, not diplomats, not Sergei Lavrov, not Donald Trump, but Syrians. And if Syrians get to decide the future of Syria, then maybe what follows will actually be a resilient and decent outcome for Syria, and thus for the rest of us. You follow my reasoning. Anyway, that's what we do today. Going back to the sorts of stories you read about in this book of what goes on at the UN Security Council, the negotiations, how diplomacy really works. which I dare say is actually pretty interesting because it's very different from the public face of diplomacy. We now bring parties to conflicts on the UN Security Council's agenda to New York to meet Security Council diplomats in private in a hotel room across the road from the UN, because they're not allowed into the UN because they're not governments and don't have the right badges. But we take leaders of guerrilla armies, victims groups from Darfur, leaders of the opposition, the democratic opposition in DRC, Congo, or Burundi. And it's an extraordinary event, sitting in these meetings in bland hotel rooms where leaders of opposition groups will say to these diplomats, unless the UN intervenes in my country, there will be genocide. And in a way, it's come full circle for me, because that is where I used to work, where I was one of the people making decisions about other people's countries, decisions about which today I feel great shame, in particular sanctions on Iraq, which did enormous damage to the Iraqi people long before the US-UK invaded that benighted country. So that is the story, if you like, of Independent Diplomat, the organisation, the analysis of how it came about and why it came about, and the deficits of diplomacy is all in this book, which has just been republished after 10 years. And there is a broader story here, which is not in the book, which is in the movie, which is about my own conversion, partly through this experience and partly through dealing with civil society groups and legitimate opposition movements all over the world, meeting, if you like, quote unquote, I don't like this word, ordinary people in Somalia, Palestine, Britain, Detroit, and realizing that they generally have a far better idea about how to fix the problems that they confront than the rest of us. And experiencing and looking into more democratic forms of self-government, direct democracy, where large numbers of people take part in their own government, including in a place called Rojava in northeast Syria, which some of you may have heard about. And through that experience, having become convinced that that form of self-government, which some call anarchism, is the right way forward for all of us, including in the West, where we confront a very serious crisis of democracy, of disillusionment, and the profound injustice wrought by the sort of capitalism that we have today. Anyway, that's another story told in another book. And I shall stop there and look forward to the discussion, which is always more entertaining and interesting than my talk. So thank you.
I'm just curious, can you explain a little bit more about your version of anarchism? I'm curious to understand what you mean by that.
Anarchism is self-government. It's the rejection of one person having power over another, which is a very beautiful principle, because I think the act of using power over other people humiliates the person using power as much as it humiliates the person subject to it. Of course, in its extreme versions, it's a kind of nasty libertarianism, of individualism, of doing whatever you want. That's not the anarchism I believe in. I believe in an anarchism of putting the community above all, and communities through democratic assemblies and new habits of direct democracy govern themselves, and indeed make rules themselves, and arbitrate disputes and wrongdoing themselves. There's a lot been written about this. I've written about it myself. Anarchism is unfortunately very widely misunderstood, and I think deliberately denigrated by defenders of the current system who, funnily enough, may benefit from the current system. Because to me, it's actually democracy. What we have today here and in America is not democracy. You don't have the governments that rule in the collective interest. They rule in somebody else's interests. We could talk about whose interests it does rule in. But I profoundly believe, having witnessed this up close, that and been part of a government, that our current system is not working. And it's actually driving us towards great social and ecological crisis, which if we don't wake up and address pretty soon is going to get pretty bad.
I have two questions. I'm wondering what's your view on Brexit and B, what's your view on the government's decision to withhold the report on foreign funding of terrorism?
Brexit. I don't mind the question, and I respect your right to ask it. It is depressing coming back to Britain, my life is Syria and Palestine and global warming, and suddenly the world shrinks down to soft Brexit, customs union, the pathetic shenanigans of the Tory party. My feelings about Brexit are complicated, and as an anarchist, you can imagine that they might be complicated. I'm a very great believer in open borders, in the fact that our lives should not be determined by where we're born, that everybody should be free to travel wherever they want. I feel that partly because of living in Germany, which was an incredible instruction in what humanity is capable of, but also how humanity can transcend that. And I think the EU embodies that beautiful dream that was never talked about in the Brexit debate. It was always treated as a transactional thing. Do we benefit? What are the costs? What will we get back? Which to me was very much a discourse of capitalism, unfortunately the discourse we've got used to, when there were bigger principles at stake. And for that reason, I was against Brexit. I'm profoundly hostile to the bureaucracy of the EU, which I've obviously had to deal with a lot. I think it's unaccountable. I think it's untransparent. I think the British actually have extraordinary power to transform the EU, because I think most people feel that it needs to be much more transparent and accountable than it is. Germans, Poles, French. And that would have been a better policy to pursue than this silly binary choice between Brexit or not Brexit, which was a reductive form of democracy. Referendums in this context are not democracy. It is a mistake to think they're democracy. They are a particular snapshot of opinion at a particular moment, where I believe democracy is a process of constant interaction, of me listening to your needs, you listening to mine, us finding compromises, ways forward, because we have to live together. And a one-off vote about something divisive is not a good way of governing ourselves.
I have a question. I'm curious about Syria. On the one hand, you say that you advise the opposition groups in Syria, and on the other hand, I read, and this may be simplistic and inaccurate, but I read that their President Assad has majority support. And so how do you reconcile what looks like anti-democratic movements in Syria that want to go against the system, while the current system has most of the people's support? How do you reconcile that with support for democracy?
I have to say that's a most extraordinary thing you've just said. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Assad is actually supported by the majority, not least because there's never been a democratic process in Syria. So that's false from the start. Let's just remember how all of this started in 2012. It was people demonstrating on the streets for democracy, which the Assad regime violently put down, arrested teenage boys, tortured them to death. So let's just remember how this war started. Yes, there are extremist groups on the rebel side. Assad has successfully destroyed many of the moderate groups, leaving not only extremist groups on the ground, but also moderate Free Syrian Army groups. It's a highly complicated picture with thousands of different armed groups across Syria. Every single Syrian I know, every single one, particularly those living in refugee camps in places like Turkey, particularly those coming from Aleppo, which has been besieged by the Syrian regime, using the most indiscriminate tactics, dropping barrel bombs on hospitals, which are deliberately targeted, with their Russian allies who've used heavy strategic bombers to bomb indiscriminately civilian areas. The Assad regime has used chemical weapons on its own people in a suburb of Damascus, as well as other places. You talk to Syrians, what they want is democracy. That is not Assad. There will not be democracy until Assad steps down. And in my view, we ought to be talking much more vigorously about how to get rid of the regime. And until that happens, there won't be democracy, because this regime is not democracy. It does not represent the majority of the people. I can understand that there are some supporters of the regime, and their needs and their need for protection should be respected in any future dispensation in Syria. But it is a grotesquerie to claim that Assad somehow represents the democratic wishes of the Syrian people.
I do respect your opinion, and I do think it is based on facts. All I was referring to was surveys where Assad was found to be popular among Syrians who are in Syria. Is that not accurate?
There's no meaningful way of conducting a survey of that kind. I mean, that's absurd. That's absolutely absurd. I'm sorry. I don't, I'm afraid, have a great deal of respect for that. I mean, it's obviously a ridiculous proposition to hold a meaningful survey of people's democratic wishes when a good 50% of the population, 50%, has been driven out of the country in the first place. How are you going to survey them? Go to camps in Jordan, speak to asylum seekers on the streets out here? How do their views get heard in a survey? Large areas of Syria are not peaceful. They're not accessible to foreign independent observers of any kind. It is extraordinarily dangerous for Westerners to go to large areas of Syria. So the possibility of having anything like an objective assessment of Syrian opinion collectively, which in any case is meaningless because it is a highly fragmented country where clearly there are lots of people who want different things. The idea that there can be a singular assessment of their opinion is ridiculous.
So I wanted to ask another question on the EU. So it seems that here in Northern Europe in general, the anti-EU sentiment comes from the right, whereas in Southern Europe it seems to proponents of non-EU deals seem to come from the left. Why do you think there's this dissonance, I guess? Hope my question makes sense.
It's a really good question, and it's an interesting observation on what's happening in Greece, Spain, really quite important seismic political developments, which in many ways I think overturn the traditional understandings of left and right. And I think probably we need a richer language to describe what's going on. I'm very hostile to terms like nationalist, populist. I think they are just labels that really obscure more than they describe, having got to know a lot of these movements in different ways. What I think unites left and right, or the movements anti-Brexit and hostility in the left in Greece against the EU, is a common theme, which is disenfranchisement of people who feel that they have no control over their economy and over their livelihoods and over their futures. And they are right to feel disenfranchised. And actually, I think, frankly, this is much more about the nature of modern capitalism, that people feel that the work they're doing is not properly rewarded. They are getting relatively poorer, whilst a very small number of people are getting a great deal richer and flaunting it in the faces of the rest of us. They feel that the work they're doing in the modern economy is not respected. That burger flipping and filling shelves and looking after the old are not respected professions. So I think these are about profound social forces that are expressed in moments like Brexit, the Brexit referendum, and expressed in movements like Syriza and others in Greece or elsewhere in Italy. And I think the questions we need to be answering ourselves go far beyond EU or not EU. One can talk about the way the EU handled Greece, for instance, and there are many things to be said about it, but I think there are broader forces at play here which need to be addressed. And unfortunately, settling ourselves in a narrow debate about Brexit or not Brexit, EU or not EU, is not embracing these bigger themes, which I think all of us sense. Everybody senses that there's something basically wrong with the economic model we're pursuing, where only a few really reap the benefits, and where immense damage, irreversible damage, is being done to the world's environment. I think future historians will look back at our generation, our society, as the most irresponsible in history, because we knew what was being done and we didn't do enough about it. And I genuinely think that governments are not going to fix this. Unless people like us, you and me, actually get busy, it ain't going to get fixed.
I have a related question. So, like, you're very critical about our current so-called democratic system we have in the West and how it deals with the big issues at hand right now. And you come up with an alternative, like you call it anarchy. But how would we go from point A to point B? There's a huge step, and I fail to see how it's actually possible to go there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's one I get a lot. I have to say, in a sense, I don't want to single you out because I really respect the question. But it disappoints me that it's not so easily imaginable. All I'm talking about is direct democracy. And I think it is plausible for us to, A, make this demand, B, learn about it, and C, start setting up assemblies and forums that practice it, where basically you invite everybody concerned with an issue or a group of issues. You could do it here at Google. You don't need to call it unionization. You just need to call it a meeting and make sure everybody is here, everybody who is affected by your decisions is included, and you start to discuss the things that bother you. And I would broaden it beyond your terms and conditions and your promotion prospects, but actually to every impact Google has in the world, because Google's impact is extraordinary. And you have far more influence than most people. Your views in this room are of immense importance. You're determining culturally, sociologically, economically, and politically our futures in important ways. Personally, I would like to see Google think about collective ownership. I believe that the form of ownership in our society of celebrating individual entrepreneurs who get lucky and make enormous fortunes, and that the rest of us are supposed to bow down to this form of the economy, is wrong. I think that we all want agency in the workplace. We all want to feel we're respected and have a share, economic, but also political, in that we have a voice. And the best way to achieve that in the workplace, where most of us spend a lot of time, is through a form of collective ownership, a cooperative. It is not implausible. It's not at all impossible. John Lewis, a big retail chain, lovely shop down on Oxford Street. John Lewis Jr. Was lying in bed after a riding accident when he realized that his family was worth more and earned more than all the hundreds of employees of his family's stores put together. And somehow he had an epiphany and decided that was wrong. And he turned over the stores to the workers, and that company has endured well over 100 years and is one of the most successful companies today, where the employees in general are pretty happy. Mondragon in Spain is Spain's 10th largest company. It's a coalition, a collective of cooperatives. It has transformed the Basque region, which was one of the most economically backward areas of Spain. It works. I absolutely reject the notion that this is kind of silly idealism. It's not at all. It can happen. It is doable, but it is in your hands. And I profoundly feel that we need to change the way we think about the possibilities of political action. We have been taught in the current dispensation that political action is activism, not a word I like, putting money in somebody's tin, making a donation, voting for politicians who by and large don't really do it for us every 5 years. We have been anesthetized. Our political power has been eviscerated from us. And we have extraordinary power, if only we use it.
I want to come back. So I actually did that. I started a political party in Belgium, which is my home country, to actually go for direct democracy. And I have first-hand experience with how impossible that process is. Like, there's literally no road to go. Like, the media is not on your side. Everyone is against it. And within Google, Google is not a democracy. So it's not up to us to decide on that process, right? So, like, what is the path? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't think this is easy. I have learned in political struggles all over the world that victory goes to the determined, to the people who don't give up. I'm not saying you're giving up. Please don't get me wrong. I really respect what you're trying to do. But there are multiple ways to change. We are trying to change a behemoth, not just Google, but a behemoth of the world's capitalist economy, a system that is defended by not only its beneficiaries, but by the laws which it has co-opted, by the governments which it has captured, by the media which it owns. And I sound like a kind of radical lefty. I'm a straightforward mainstream guy. I'm bourgeois. I'm a white male. If people are middle-aged, people like me are saying this, then there's something really wrong with the system. And I think there is enormous appetite for this. Everywhere I go, I hear people saying, how do I do it? What can I do? It's an electrifying question. And I think that if you sit with people who care about it in the same way that you do, you will figure something out. I can't tell you what that thing is. I'd be glad to meet again and talk about the specific circumstances that you're facing, because I think this is about specifics. I can make bland pronouncements about how political change happens and sort of fire everybody up. I do think the devil is in the detail. I work constantly on political change every day, from the Western Sahara to Palestine and Syria. And it is a detailed struggle. I think one of the lies that we're told is that society can be transformed by Jeremy Corbyn, by Theresa May, by leaving the EU or not leaving the EU. These are not true. Society is each one of us atoms. I believe in complexity theory, where each of our actions creates the whole, but actually each of our actions can, in certain circumstances, so-called criticality, transform the whole. I actually think we're at a point of criticality. The Arab world was at a point of criticality when the Arab Spring swept the Middle East. I think young people in particular are at a point of criticality in the West, because they get it. They get that this is not working.
Thank you for coming. My question is about Turkey, and if you could comment the last recent events from the coup to the referendum and the current crackdown. Thank you.
Oh. Could I ask, are you Turkish?
No.
Oh, okay. Is anybody Turkish here? Okay. Well, I know a bit about Turkey. I'm no expert, and I would say, if there was a Turk here, I would actually turn to them. And I really believe that's the right thing to do. Erdogan is a proto-fascist. He is cracking down on the free press. There's a trial going on right now of journalists. He's cracked down on the opposition, the democratic opposition, and he is waging a war, a merciless war, against the Kurdish population in the southeast. Which the West, I'm afraid, this government here and the German government and others are not doing anything like enough about, because they've struck a deal with Erdogan to stop people swimming across a small strait between Turkey and the nearest Greek island to try to migrate to Europe. And that deal to them is more important than the lives of Turks and human rights in Turkey and democracy in Turkey. It's very, very depressing to see. And the level of violence and repression is really staggering. It's a story that's not being told, particularly what's going on in southeast Turkey, where whole towns are being shelled, heavy weapons, tanks are being used in civilian areas. And this country is not a democracy. It is an emerging dictatorship. I don't think you can really argue that democracy exists in a situation where the opposition are as repressed as they are and where free press does not really exist. And yet they are treated as a legitimate government, not subject to sanction, but in fact we sit down with them and do deals with them because we want the Erdogan's no fool. He's played us.
I wanted to come back to the involvement of the British in Iraq. I find this deeply fascinating. I think this has not come anywhere near a resolution from your vantage point, from what you've seen behind the scenes. How did this happen? What was the motivation? What are the forces behind it? There's this narrative that Tony went to the States and had a little chat with his friend Georgie, and they agreed, yeah, I'm going to help you, but there's got to be more to it. Like what were the driving forces that resulted in such a disaster and that necessitated all the lies and around it?
That's a really good question. Obviously one I've dwelt on a lot. and to which I do not have a complete answer, because this was a top-down decision driven by Bush and Blair. The view in the British government when I worked on Iraq was absolutely that regime change was a bad idea because Iraq would fracture between Shia and Sunni, and that is, of course, what's happened. When I was a British diplomat, we would go to the State Department on every quarter for our big Iraq bilaterals, where a few of us from the British government who dealt with Iraq would sit facing a whole team of the US administration. And sometimes the State Department would privately ask us beforehand to bring up the subject of regime change so that we could say what a bad idea it was, so that the hawks in the Department of Defense, the Pentagon and elsewhere would hear that their closest allies did not support it. That was the view. I know for fact, this isn't speculation, a he said, she said debate. I know for a fact that the reason they give about the war, that they thought Iraq was a threat, that they were misled by the intelligence, that is a lie. That is a lie. I know the intelligence in great detail. I probably know more about it than almost anybody who worked for any of these governments. I worked on almost nothing else for 4.5 years. And our assessment for all of those years was that Iraq's WMD, we thought they may have some so-called residual stocks. There were accounting errors in the destruction of Iraq's WMD, its ballistic missiles, chemical and biological weapons, for which Iraq could not account. And we thought that what was then called the material balance indicated that there might be stocks we did not know about, but we had no hard evidence of anything, missiles, CW or BW. And certainly at these bilaterals that I attended, we would begin them by saying the policy of containment is working. Iraq is not a threat. And almost overnight that changed. And the thing that changed it was 9/11. And looking at this through the lens that I now look at it, I realized that part of what was going on was that the authority of the American government was deeply challenged by 9/11. It had failed in its fundamental duty to protect the people, which is the contract we all make with government. We're not asked to make this contract, but we're in this contract that we give up our liberty and allow ourselves to be ruled and legislated about and ruled by law in return for them protecting us. That's the deal, the Lockean contract, the Hobbesian contract. And they failed in that deal. And they had to do something to show that they could still protect the people. It was an assertion, a deliberate assertion of power in order to reaffirm its legitimacy. And it was a lie. Without 9/11, it would not have happened. I saw day by day how a narrative was created in the US administration by the neoconservatives, Richard Perle, Wolfowitz, and others, that Iraq was a threat, that toppling Saddam would lead to broader change in the Middle East, which would drain the swamp, which would cause a sort of modern-day version of the domino effect that, of course, had been the logic in Vietnam, ironically, that would bring democracy to the Middle East and thus make Middle East-based terrorism to starve it at its roots. And that theory became dominant after 9/11 because nobody had a better one. And, this was an epic failure of government. We think that governments sit there and rationally debate different alternate policy options. That is not how it happens. Politicians make decisions that are often emotional, ill thought through, spontaneous, and the officials go out and collect the evidence to justify that policy. It is the opposite of scientific method, which is to go out, look at the evidence, then make a theory about how to deal with it, as I learnt from Thomas Kuhn in that library. That's one of the things that was going on, not by any means the only one.
Thank you very much, Carne Ross.